So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Natalie Hollier, and this is my co-host Hannah, and we both work here at ThoughtWorks. And as you know, Products with Purpose is a meetup for social entrepreneurs, designers, product managers, technologists, anyone who's interested in having more environmental sustainability and social impact in your careers, and learning about different tools and techniques that we can bring to that. And so today we're learning about the Flourishing Business Canvas. So before we get started, just to frame a little bit more about what do we mean by purpose, we're talking about taking a triple bottom line approach, looking at people, planet, and profit. So looking beyond just profit at the impact that business can have in society, because business doesn't exist in a vacuum. We can't just focus on the financial benefits that we have and externalize all the impacts that we're having to society and to the environment, because this nested dependency model shows, human society is wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, and without food and water and air and soil and other resources, society couldn't survive, and so the economy couldn't survive. So a great example of kind of business model innovation I saw the other day was an article about a grocer in the UK who are providing boxes of vegetables for £1.50, which are a little bit old, so they're just before they go used by, they're starting to maybe look a bit wilted, but they're still perfectly fine. And so by providing this extra add-on to their business, they're helping to make food more affordable to those who couldn't otherwise afford it, and also helping to prevent food waste, which creates a lot of CO2 emissions when it decomposes, not to mention all of the emissions when it's actually used to water and grow it and transport it and so on. And so that's just an example of kind of how any business can think to innovate and extend their business model and to create more sustainable products and services. So going on to the next slide, we see a confluence of trends which are driving towards a fundamental shift in the role of business in society, and seeing business as a force for good in the world. And so just to illustrate a couple of key major examples in driving this trend, I'm sure a lot of people attending would be aware of the latest IPCC report on climate change, saying that we have around 11 or 12 years to prevent catastrophic tipping point of the impacts of global warming. And we see a lot of pressure around this, especially in the past few months since the release of the report. In terms of social trends, there's some research done by different groups looking at consumer segments, and seeing that around 40% of the global population and growing are this group called aspirationals, who care about buying quality designed products, but they also care about the ethics and sustainability, and they want both of those things. They want the and, not an or. And if you add to that kind of the eco-friendly group, that's around 26% of the population, so that's 66%, or well over half of the global population that this is really meaningful for. And in terms of business, sustainability reporting, or ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is becoming mainstream in sustainable stock exchange initiatives, in reporting, and we see the advent of B corporations, which Eric and Anthony will be talking about a little bit. So this is just an example of some of the many factors that are shaping this trend, and for businesses and products and services and companies who are listening to and responding to this now, it's a real competitive advantage for them. But for everyone else, it's quickly becoming table stakes as well to continue to retain talent. This also applies to employees, not just consumers. They want to work for companies with purpose, and have consumers buy your product from meaningful and purposeful brands. And beyond thinking about just sustainability, particularly relevant for today is going beyond sustainability to think about regenerative design or flourishing. So on the next slide is an example of a model that's taken from the building, construction, or architecture world, where far over on the left is we think about conventional practice is, we can't pollute more than this certain amount. We can't poison people. We can't dump toxic waste. And so we try to do better and be a bit more efficient and reduce to have a bit less waste. And when people talk about zero waste or net neutral, it's actually only achieving zero harm. So we want to go beyond that. We want to actually give back and further develop and restore the natural and social ecosystems to leave them better than they were before. So on to the next slide. I think this is a great introduction for our two speakers today, Antony and Eric, who are joining us. Thank you so much, both remote from Canada and Germany. So Antony is an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Design at OCAD University in Toronto, and he's also an adjunct professor in Business Model Innovation Group at the Center for Innovation, Entrepreneurship and Learning at Halmstad University in Sweden, as well as a flourishing enterprise designer at Edward James Consulting, a certified B Corp, and the originator of the Flourishing Business Canvas. And Eric is owner of FATH Consulting, which in partnership with Bismundi is developing a flourishing enterprise transformation company for business and government. And he also acts as program and project manager with the Flourishing Enterprise Innovation Toolkit. So today they're going to be talking about business modeling tools and the power of business modeling for organizational leaders, and give an experience of the Flourishing Business Canvas and a walkthrough of a case study of the business model for a certified B Corporation and how they use the canvas, and explain how it can be used to develop better fit for the future strategies for both established businesses and as well as startups, products and services. And we're going to have some time at the end as well for a little bit of Q&A, which you can either post in the chat or I'll add it in the chat for those who are in the room. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Antony and Eric. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for that very great introduction and overview, and very warm introduction to Eric and myself. So thank you very much. And hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. I am sitting here in Toronto, and Eric is in Groningen in the Netherlands. So we'll be doing our best to guide you through a little journey to introduce you to the Flourishing Business Canvas in the next half an hour or so, and then we hope we'll have a good chance for conversation towards the end of the hour together. I actually wanted to go back one slide in Natalie's introduction and just sort of connect this beyond zero harm to the word flourishing, which you'll hear us use quite a lot in the next half an hour or so. So I thought I'd connect it to what Natalie has just said. So as Natalie observed, this middle point, I think you can probably see my cursor here right at the middle of the two axes, is kind of where we're, as a society, generally heading right now. This would be called sustainable development. This is what the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals talks about. And this is sort of survival. This is good enough. And so the question that, this is sustainability, keeping things the same. And so the question that many of us asked, perhaps as long ago as 15 or so years, is that really all we're aspiring to as a species? Being good enough, surviving? Isn't there something higher that we want to be aiming for, something more aspirational, something more exciting than simply survival? And when we looked about at what would be a really attractive and possible outcome to shoot for, what we discovered was exactly what the diagram shows over here, that there's a lot of potential good that can be created well beyond survival. And so what should we call that? What label can we give it? What shorthand label can we give that top right-hand corner of this chart? And so we chose the word flourishing. If you want a slightly longer definition that puts that word into a sentence, then Professor John Ehrenfeld at MIT, who's one of the people who started the field of industrial ecology, says that what we should be trying to sustain is the possibility for human and other life to flourish on this planet for 7 generations and beyond. And so this is our idea of flourishing. This is the big picture. And so within this, the question then becomes, how do we do that from an organizational perspective? What role do organizations play in creating that possibility for flourishing? And how do we help leaders of organizations, whether you're a startup or an existing business, build towards that? So let me use that to shift to my slides at this point, and to start by the idea of a business model. So one of the ideas that's become very prevalent in business over the last couple of decades is the idea that we should design our businesses. So if you're a designer, you're all designers, many of you working with ThoughtWorks and in the ThoughtWorks community. You're very used to designing products, you're very used to designing user interfaces, you're very used to designing services. So in all of those cases, there's a thing you're designing, whether it's the table, chair, building, landscape, or whether it's something more conceptual like a user interface. There's still design documentation that you're using to describe the thing itself. So if you're trying to design a business, what's the thing you're going to design? And so the answer in the last 15 years, the thing we're going to design is a model of the business. So it's not the business itself, it's a model of the business. So like any model, it's a simplification. So what is a business model? If that's what we're going to try and design, what is it? Well, the first thing we've got to recognize is, as Natalie just said, it's got to be a model that recognizes the full context for business. As Natalie said, if the business doesn't recognize its interdependencies with the economy, society, and the environment, the business isn't going to be very viable in the short, medium, or long term. So it needs to recognize that. And so we see a business model as something that is, yes, has an economic perspective, but it's an economic perspective contextualized in society, and that's further contextualized by the environment. So it really needs to be a model of how the business is going to interrelate with all three of these things. And so the way we define a business model is it's a description of how an enterprise defines and achieves success over time. And that's both a story of how it's going to do that, and also the numbers that explain how that story works. So how many customers are you going to have? How much are you going to charge for your product or service? How many kilograms of raw materials are you going to need in order to go into your product? What sort of level of happiness are you going to generate for your employees and customers? What sort of impacts are you going to have on the environment and on other stakeholders that perhaps are not so good, costs in other words. So this is what we understand by a business model. And one of the key things that came out of the research that we did is that over the last 25 years, there's been quite a dramatic shift in the way that business has understood how it generates value. So the way that we used to think about this, and this, by the way, is conventional thinking. This is, what you'd learn in a business school. There's nothing particularly sustainable about this, but it is very useful if you want to think sustainably. So the way that we used to think about it is that we in an enterprise, as business people, we thought that we would know our customers so well that we would create our product or our service, and it would be so perfect for the customer, it would be like a gift. It's why we have the gift icon here as the representation of value. And it's in fact the icon that's used on the business model canvas as well. We know our customers so well, we could beautifully wrap up our product or service, we'd hand it to the customer, and the customer would be so delighted, they would pay us. And that was the transaction, the way we understood value. We understand the customer, we create the product, we give it to the customer pays us. That's it, that's all. So this is the old idea of the way we thought about value. So what's happened in the last 15, 25 years is that this works if all your customers are the same. Because you really can understand perfectly what all your customers want, and you really can perfectly create the gift to them. But in fact, we know that's not true, and it's getting less and less true. Our customer base, and in fact our stakeholder base, so our investors, our suppliers, our employees, are all getting more and more diverse. And so this old way is becoming less and less useful when you're designing a business. You're trying to think in your business model what the value is that I'm going to be creating. So what we've learned more recently is that value is something that actually co-occurs in all the interactions and all the relationships with all of our stakeholders. So it's no longer a one-way, I give you something, you give me money. It's now a dialogue. It's now a conversation. It's now a series of interactions where we're learning about each other, where we're sharing information, where we're indeed sharing, passing money backwards and forwards between us. So value is now something that's an ongoing dialogue between us. And if you think about sustainability, if you think about flourishing is not a transaction. It's something that has to go on over time. So it's, walking into your neighborhood store and it's being greeted by somebody that knows you, that you've transacted with before. It's them remembering who you are. It's then you remembering who they are. That all creates value for you. That's why you like shopping in the corner store versus the impersonal mall. So this is the sort of rethinking of value that we see as being absolutely critical to getting to flourishing as an outcome. So the next thing that we need if we're going to work on our business model is we need a shared language. A business is a very complex thing. It's got lots and lots of different parts, including the value generation part of it. So if we're going to create a business model, we have to do that as a conversation as well. So that means that if we start off without a shared language, it's going to be very difficult. Your idea of what a business model is, my idea of what a business model is, what you think the parts of a business model are all very undefined. They're all very different from person to person. So it would be really fast, really useful if we could get a shared language to start with for designing and telling stories about our business models. That would be a real powerful accelerator. And as we're moving into sustainable and flourishing business models, there's a lot more to think about. In the old way of thinking, we were just thinking about money, basically. And so that was perhaps a little more straightforward. Perhaps it was an oversimplification. Now we understand business is got to be connected to the economy, society, and the environment. So there's more things to think about. So there's more elements to this language that are going to be created. So having a shared language that's more inclusive of all the factors is going to be very, very helpful. We want a language that for business models that includes all the necessary financial, social, and environmental aspects. And so we've got a group of people here illustrated by these little cartoon figures. These people, let's say they want to design a new business. And to do that, to have a good conversation about that business, to design their business model, they need that shared language. And so our response is to bring to you a holistic enterprise design tool, which we call the Flourishing Business Canvas. And the Flourishing Business Canvas is at its heart a tool that gives you, as people designing business, a common language expressed in a visual way, which I'll show you in a moment, that will allow you to work with other people to collaboratively sketch, prototype, design, improve, understand, measure, diagnose, and tell stories about any business model. You can do that description economically, socially, and environmentally. You can describe how your business is today, or you can design how you'd like it to be in the future. And at its heart, that's what the Flourishing Business Canvas allows you to do. So, many of you know the Business Model Canvas. Some of you perhaps haven't heard it. So the little story about the Business Model Canvas is about 15 years ago, a PhD student in Switzerland, Alexander Osterwalder, asked the question, so what are the factors that we need to describe to think about the short-term profitability of a business? What would be those business model factors? Now, to be fair to Alex, actually, he didn't say that. What he said was, what are the factors that make up a business model? He never recognized that he was operating in a business school where they make an assumption that the only thing that's important is money. And so he narrowed his research. He kept his research focused only on the factors that were, as I've just said, the factors that are responsible for short-term profitability. And so he came up with this extremely useful and powerful visual canvas called the Business Model Canvas. And it has 9 questions on it. I don't know if you can see this on your screens, but over on the right-hand side here, you have customer segments. Then you've got revenue streams from those customer segments, the relationships and channels, value propositions in the center here. Again, using the gift idea. So he was very much thinking about value creation as a one-way transaction, the activities you need to perform to create the value for your customers, the key resources that you need with the activities to create the value propositions, and the key partners. And then down at the bottom here, you've got cost. So the things on the left here drive your cost side of your profit and loss statement, and the things on the right here drive the revenue side of your profit and loss statement. So 9 questions. And as I said, the problem with Alex's work today is that now we understand that that is at best an incomplete description of a business model, and worse, given all the factors that are coming from the environmental and the social world that impact business, this tool will mean that as users, as people trying to design business, if you use this tool, it will tend to mean that you're going to miss things that are really important to business going forward. You're going to miss social license to operate. You're going to miss sustainability almost completely with this model. It's never going to prompt you. There's no language here to prompt you to think about these things in today's increasingly complex world. So this is where the Flourishing Business Canvas comes in. So this is comes from some research that originally I started, and now a global community of people using this tool and testing it out and helping to make it better. And we recognize that Alex actually did a really good job of the questions on the financial side of things. So his 9 questions are still all here in the Flourishing Business Canvas. If you've used the business model canvas, you can take your post-it notes from the canvas and put them onto the Flourishing Business Canvas with no changes. But what's happened is we've put those questions into context. So for example, we have here stakeholders. So stakeholders is there because, of course, your most important stakeholder is your customer, same as the business model canvas. But actually, now that you've put customers into context of the economy, society, and the environment, you can see these 3 rectangles on the background here. We're no longer only interested in customers who pay us. We're interested in all of our stakeholders: employees, suppliers, investors, owners, community, regulators. Anybody who's a stakeholder of this business can now be modeled on the Flourishing Business Canvas. And the same thing has happened to the other 9 questions. We're no longer only interested in resources that we pay for, so that would be the area of the resource box overlapping economy. We're also interested in resources that we get socially, or resources we get from the environment that we don't have to pay for. Oh, resource we don't have to pay for? What would be an example of that? Can somebody put some examples in the chat? What would be an example of a resource we don't have to pay for? But it's absolutely critical.
Someone just put air, yep.
Air, exactly. What for? What would we use air for in a business?
To keep our employees alive.
Yeah, keep our employees alive, yep. Cooling, circulation. How about transportation? We're using an internal combustion engine that depends on oxygen, which is in the air, in order to create the explosion with the gasoline that we've paid for. So air is a resource, absolutely. Oxygen is a resource for the business. We don't have to pay for it. In fact, not only do we not have to pay for the air, we also don't have to pay to dump the pollution back into the atmosphere. So if you combust your air in a truck and you produce some CO2 and you can drop that into the atmosphere, unless you're in a place where there's some carbon taxes, then you absolutely can drop that carbon dioxide and all the other waste products back into the atmosphere, and you don't have to pay for that, but it's absolutely critical to your business. There's no way that you could include that on the business model canvas because there's no conception of anything that doesn't cost you money. Here we can say, oh, we've got an environmental resource, and that's going to have an environmental cost down at the bottom here that we can express simply in, say, tons of carbon dioxide emitted, or tons of pollutants, or whatever it is that we're having to generate in order to conduct our business. So you can see here that in the Flourishing Business Canvas, what we've done is we've included the necessary factors to assess financially material risks, also socially and environmentally ones, but guess what? Socially and environmental risks are actually going to have a financial consequence. And we also include all the factors that will enable you to innovate and find opportunity that are going to be relevant today and increasingly relevant over time, as more and more we understand that we have to have our businesses at least get to the center of that diagram that Natalie showed, and preferably go beyond that towards flourishing and regeneration. So this is the basic idea. So what this will allow you to do is it empowers you to co-create mutual benefit with your stakeholders. So there's a group of you, your innovators, your practitioners, your leaders, your entrepreneurs, and what you're going to do as a group is you're going to create a model of your business, and hopefully you're going to choose to aim for that business to do good, to do well for all of your stakeholders. And then you're going to take that model and you're going to actually make that model real in the world. You're going to actually start a business following that model, and that will help create the possibility for flourishing to exist. And then from that experience, the innovators will learn, and you'll improve your model over time, and you'll improve your business over time. And so our response here is going to help you accelerate this feedback loop by giving you a common language to do the modeling that includes all the factors that are necessary for you to think about to enable the possibility for flourishing. We're going to accelerate this feedback loop to drive benefit yourself, for your business, and indeed for the world. So this is the big picture of where we're trying to head to now. The other thing I wanted to mention is how the business model connects to your vision and goals. So some of you probably know of Simon Sinek's work. Simon Sinek's been talking for quite a few years now about the idea that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And he invented this, and he said that as an entrepreneur, if you start with why, like I did today with, why we're doing this is to enable the possibility for flourishing, you actually make yourself much more attractive to your audiences, and they were much more likely to follow you and be part of who you are. So Simon Sinek's example here is Apple usually, and he said, Apple always talks about our purpose, our reason for existing is to help people think differently. That was their campaign, their slogan from many, many years. They didn't start with we make computers, which is what you do. They started with why they do it, to enable people to think different. So that's what we're doing. We're starting with thinking differently. We're starting with the purpose here is flourishing, the vision is flourishing, the why is flourishing. So you start with why, and then you work on the how, and then you work on the what. So this is Simon Sinek's golden circle, as he called it. And to relate this to the business model, obviously all the answers you come up with to your why, your how, and your what relate to everything on the canvas. How you're going to do something is going to talk to, for example, your activities. What you're going to do is going to talk to your value co-creations, as an example. But the why actually relates very specifically to just one question on the canvas, which is the goals. So when you come up with your why, it's going to drive the goals that you're going to set up for the business. And you'll notice again, the goals box, you can think about those goals financially. And of course you should, because if you're not financially viable, your business is going to go bankrupt. You won't exist. So you think about your financial goals, but also it gives you a chance to think about your social and environmental goals as well. So this is the connection now between the canvas and the vision of the business. So enough conceptual stuff. Let me show you an example. So for our 180 plus first explorers, we give them access to this online tool called Murally. And in Murally, they get access to free access to a room where there's an electronic canvas. And this is, you can see now, has quite a lot of words on it. We can zoom in here and read these words if we want. And this this size of canvas with these words on, typically when we print it out, it will be a couple of meters by 1.5 meters, so 6-7 feet by 5 feet or so. And all these words will be on it. And you put this up on the wall, and a group of you would get around here and you'd start to respond to these questions. So let me walk you through a quick example of some responses for this company called Tiffin Day. So Tiffin Day is a certified B Corp. They are here in Toronto, and the business model I'm going to show you here, start to build here to describe Tiffin Day, is one that they had about 4 years ago. They've actually evolved their business since then, but this is the one from about 4 or 5 years ago. So Tiffin Day is a lunchtime business, and who their customers are is young single men. And why do the young single men buy from Tiffin Day? What's the primary reason why they buy? Well, they buy from Tiffin Day because Tiffin Day provides them with delicious, balanced, fresh, plant-based, boutique, high-quality meals based on South Asian recipes. It's great food. That's why these people buy, and they buy because they're too busy to make their own lunch. They want delicious food made available to them. There's a second part of the value that Tiffin Day creates with its lunchtime eaters. You can order online, and it's delivered to your desk in your office tower in the financial district of downtown Toronto. So it's great food. You order it online, and it shows up at your desk. So you're a busy, go ahead young person. You want to spend every moment working at your job, and Tiffin Day allows you to eat healthily in a great way, really convenient, delivered to your desk. So how does Tiffin Day do that? So it's moving on to the activities on the side here. So so to do that, they have to prepare some food and cook it and pack it to get it to you. And to do that, they need some things called tiffins, and well as some insulated bags to keep the tiffins hot. So a tiffin is South Asian Tupperware. It's made of stainless steel. You can stack them up, so you can keep all the separate dishes like a curry and the bread and the rice all in a separate container, and you stack them up and they all lock together in a very convenient carrying handle. So it keeps it hot, keeps them separate, and guess what? Those are reusable. So we'll come back to that a little bit more in a moment. So what I've just got here now is the elevator pitch for Tiffin Day, just with these 4 stickies on the canvas. Tiffin Day provides delicious food in a way that is convenient, delivered to your desk to lunchtime eaters. And we do this by prepping the food, cooking it, packing it, and we do that in tiffins. That's the summary of this business. So far, this is all very conventional. There's nothing particularly sustainable about this. There's nothing particularly unusual about this. And that's further reinforced by the fact that Seema's primary objective is to be sufficiently profitable. Just like any other business, she needs to be viable financially. So what's special about this business? Well, it starts with the other part of why Seema started this business. Seema Pabari is the CEO, I should say. And she started this business in order to give her time to be a mother. She's a single mom, and she was finding that her job in the big corporate world was just too demanding for her, that she couldn't be there for her son in the mornings to take him to school, and she couldn't be there in the afternoons to pick him up. She wanted to be able to have more time to be a mother. And this, of course, leads you to understand why it's lunchtime eaters. Why isn't she doing delivery in the evening? Well, because she wants to be with her son. So this is a lunchtime business. So she needed a way, therefore, to differentiate her business at lunchtime, which is where she came up with the idea of doing delivery, which is actually based on her culture. This is a model for food delivery that was developed and is extremely popular in Mumbai in India, is where this originated. And there's actually a great love story about this, love story movie about this called The Lunchbox. If you've never seen that movie, and you're looking for a good movie for date night, then I highly recommend it. It's a really lovely love story that will show exactly how this works in Mumbai, in India, every single day. So then Seema had another objective, which, as I mentioned, she's from India. So she has that South Asian culture, and she was keen to support and promote that culture and the community around this. So she actually had this as another goal. So this is another social goal that she had. And the last goal that she had was an environmental one. She was very keen on contributing to a healthy environment. So how did all that play out when she started to design her business model? So the first thing she thought of was, well, are there any people in my community who have the same challenge I have of needing time to be a mother? And she went, wow, yeah, sure. There's lots of people like me in my community, lots of much newer immigrants to Canada who need the opportunity to be able to, in addition to herself, so she's a stakeholder of the business, she's the owner, and her son is a stakeholder because he's going to receive value from the time that Seema gets. But now she's also recognizing, she's also recognizing that another stakeholder will be who her potential employees are, which is new Canadian women with limited hours available for work. They also need to be able to take their kids to school in the mornings. They also need to be there to pick them up in the afternoons. And so the only time they have to work is the window in the middle, which is shorter than a regular working day. And also typically these people, as new immigrants, they don't have a food handling certificate. They don't necessarily have all the Canadian qualifications. So by providing them with that, it gives them an additional benefit. And again, I could be adding some more stickies to describe some of these things that I'm now just mentioning verbally. So in terms of value co-creations, some other, I've gone too far, other value co-creations that this business creates for various stakeholders. It creates time for family, it enriches the community, and it also is environmentally sustainable because it's plant-based food. So it's vegan food. Vegan food. I'm having trouble scrolling around here. vegan food has a much, much lower carbon footprint, as one example, than, for example, meat and dairy products. So these are now some value co-creations for the stakeholders. And some other things that worth noting in terms of resources is she has a South Asian inspired menu. She buys local ingredients when she can. She has an electric delivery vehicle. And it turns out that that's not only because that's environmentally sustainable, but in Toronto, the parking regulations means that she can park that outside the office buildings on the sidewalk and not get parking tickets because it's electric. And another resource is she didn't have the money to build a kitchen for herself to do the cooking. So what she does is she found a local Indian restaurant that's vegan, that's closed at lunchtimes, but was willing to lease her the kitchen and the licensed chef. So that way she cut down on her startup costs. And then in terms of activities, other activities, obviously she's got to acquire the ingredients. She's actually got to do the deliveries and also pick up the tiffins. So here's another aspect of reuse. This isn't recycling, this is actual reuse, because those stainless steel tiffins come back from the customers, another activity is getting feedback from customers to inform future recipe development. So we can start to see here now there's a whole bunch of additional factors that really you would never think about if you were using the 9 questions of the business model canvas, and yet these things together are what allow her to meet her goals. The couple of others I just want to illustrate here on the right-hand side. She obviously understands that a key biophysical stock that she's relying on is plants, and she also recognizes to make those tiffins, she is using some iron and chromium to make the stainless steel. She also recognizes that to wash all of those ingredients and to clean the tiffins, she's very dependent on the water cycling process. So this is what you probably remember from grade school. You know, the sun shines on the ocean, evaporates the water, wind blows that over the land, and that falls as rain, and that's where we get all our fresh water from. So she's recognizing her interdependency with the environment there. And of course, she's also recognizing that she's very dependent on photosynthesis, because without plants growing in the healthy soil, she would have no raw materials for her product. And just put on a few last stickies here to illustrate the story. Obviously, she has to pay for the ingredients. She has to pay for her chef. She has to pay wages to her employees, but she also is measuring her carbon and chemical footprints in system international units, so kilograms and such like. And she also, on the benefits side of things, she measures socially the number of hires she makes of people with barriers to employment. So that's typically the immigrants. She also measures how many times she manages to have breakfast and dinner at home with her kids and for her employees as well. And obviously financially, her revenue comes from the food sales. So there's a few more stickies I could put on here, but I think you get the general idea. And you can see how I've been using this to tell a story about this business model. And the story is really quite complex. And yet I think now you've got a fairly good handle on how Tiffin Day works, because I've got a common language here on the canvas. We didn't have to have a big discussion about what did these 4 stickies mean. You knew automatically they were stakeholders. You intuitively got an understanding of what a stakeholder is, because it's not a really super common word in English, but it's a word most people know. And the same for almost all the words on here. These words have common meanings, and where they don't, it's because they're topics like biophysical stocks and ecosystem services, which have not yet become important to business, but the science is telling us are absolutely critical to business going forward. And so we need to use some unfamiliar terminology, and we need to get people to learn. We need people to ask, why is biophysical stocks on here? Well, all the stuff you use in your business actually matters to your overall viability as a business, environmentally, socially, and economically. So with that, let's come back to the slides for a second. My slides. So we just went through the example. And I wanted to tell you that we have 180 individuals and organizations worldwide who are now using the Flourishing Business Canvas and some other things in the toolkit that we're providing. This is still in development, but we've already got quite a number using it in various different ways. Some people with startups, some people to come up with the business models with new products, some people with helping existing enterprise develop new strategy. So there's a whole bunch of different use cases that designing business models can have, and here's some examples. And if you go to the link that's at the top of the screen there, you can learn more about our First Explorers licensing program. It's free, but the reason we're licensing this at the moment is because we want the feedback from people using it so we can make it better. Once we finish development, we will be releasing the Flourishing Business Canvas under a Creative Commons license without any restrictions of any kind other than a BYSA clause. So, but until that happens, we're asking people to license it, but that's at no charge. So with that, let me ask you all a question. How could this be useful in your work? I'm happy to take other questions as well. And I can see that there's been questions streaming by, so I think Natalie's going to do a little curation on the question process. And Natalie, you're muted.
Yeah, I think so far in the chat, it's more been comments around B corporations and answering some of your earlier questions. But I think you had a slide on B Corp. So while we're waiting, if anyone wants to add any other questions in the chat, maybe it would be good to talk about that for.
Oh, yes. So so there's a not-for-profit organization in Philadelphia called B Lab. And just over 10 years ago now, the founders of that NGO said to themselves, how could we help companies, first of all, demonstrate that the company, not the product or the service, but the company itself is attempting to generate benefit economically, socially, and environmentally. So this is for-profit companies. And the way they decided to do this was they set up a certification. And there's a survey that you take called the B Impact Assessment, BIA, and that will give you a score out of 200 points. And to become a certified B Corp, where B Lab, the NGO, comes in and certifies you that you are in fact generating benefit, you have to get more than 80 out of 200 points. And getting 80 is not so easy for conventional businesses. The highest scoring B Corps on the planet right now are scoring in the 130 to 140 range. So a lot of the gap between getting that high score and 200 is because in our current world, it's actually not possible because of law, regulation, market conditions, etc., to score 200 points. But what B Lab is doing is they're anticipating that it will become possible, and they are anticipating that people will want to try. And of course, when people try, they're going to lobby to get regulation changed. They're going to lobby to get laws changed. They're going to lobby for new types of products and services, and they're going to create new types of products and services that would score more and more points in that scheme. So I became certified 2 years ago in my company, Edward James Consulting, and we're actually just about to recertify. Where you get every day. And actually, I should say the biggest reason why people become B Corp turns out it's not because their customers want it, it's because their employees are demanding it. Turns out that the young people don't want to work for companies who are doing harm in the world. And so young people are very attracted to companies who, through the certification, are demonstrating through a third party evidence that they are doing good in the world. And so it means that your cost of attracting new top talent goes down and your cost of retaining top talent stays down. So that's the biggest single reason people become B Corps today. Although there are customers who want it, etc. So Tiffin Day is a B Corp as well, as an example.
I have a question that I'd like to ask specifically about what you include on this board in terms of scope, and specifically, as you start to think about, how everything is connected, no matter what you do, you have all these follow-on actions. I could imagine it being the case that, especially with a larger business or with a larger population, that you end up kind of, no pun intended, boiling the ocean, and you have so many far-reaching impacts. So I'm curious if there is sort of a limit to what you want to include on here in terms of maybe 1, 2, 3 steps removed, or something you can measure so that you can, determine the impact that you have on it, et cetera. Or if you want to include, kind of as far as you can see into the distance in every direction, if that makes sense.
That's an absolutely fabulous question, Hannah. Thank you very much. the several different answers to that. The first one is it depends on what your goals are.
Mm.
So, and that depends on your purpose. So, if you're working with your co-founders and with other stakeholders, once you know what your purpose is, and you set up what the goals of the business is, that will help you answer the question you just asked in terms of how far do you go.
Mm.
So if you then ask if I'm designing a business model, let's say for 18 months from now, there's a whole bunch of things we know aren't going to change in 18 months. So there's probably not much point in worrying about them at this point.
Mm-hmm.
However, if your ultimate purpose is to, for example, enable the possibility of flourishing, it's clear that those bigger picture factors are going to be important. So today, for example, perhaps a company making refrigerators doesn't care about the CO2 that's generated powering that refrigerator during its use phase. But in the long term, they know absolutely that if the trends go the way we think they're going to go, they will actually be accountable for that CO2 emission of their product in use. So what do you do about that? So the answer to that we have is another part of the toolkit, where in our methods we use something called backcasting, and we suggest that you do a business model that looks 10, 20, even 30 years in the future. How are you going to be viable in the world then? And you then have to make some hypotheses about, well, maybe there's going to be product legislation and regulation at that point that says if you make it and it consumes electricity, you're responsible for the CO2 emissions that are generated. And so therefore you're incented to really do some pretty radical stuff in terms of your product design. So there's three ways of thinking about that, but it's fundamentally based on what your purpose is.
Mm. Any other questions?
I should just mention.
I may have one.
I mentioned that when you get the slides at the bottom here, there's a link to a video of me doing the Tiffin Day business model in a little bit more detail with some discussion. So if you want to go over it again afterwards, that is available as a YouTube video. Sorry, go ahead. Question.
Hi. Thank you very much for all this conference. It's very interesting. This is my first time with seeing these charts, and it's very interesting. So I'm thinking about applying this to my business idea that it's sustainable, but I have no, I'm not sure if the things that I'm gonna feel are exactly I'm taking I don't know how to say it, I don't know. Don't look at me.
Sorry, you're worried that what you write on the Post-it notes might not be
exactly if I'm not taking all the information and organizing exactly the way that you just did it. It's fabulous. It's just exactly I can just mix everything up and just so I don't know.
So, Eric, did you want to respond to that one?
Yes, if I may. I totally understand what you're feeling. I'm a relatively new first explorer to the group, now helping them on the team. And exactly right. I mean, you're trying to develop something, and okay, those examples are nice, but if I'm hearing you and feeling the same, am I representing it correctly when I'm developing it? So that's what you're feeling, yes?
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for the direction.
So yes, totally get it. And for me, shameless plug for the First Explorer community, but when I joined the First Explorer community, then I got guidance as well as ability to talk to people like Antony and others, and as well as the rest of the First Explorers community at large, and get some guidance on what to do, just to get someone checking and giving some feedback.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
I'll also add to that. Thank you for that, Eric. That's a great answer. And I'll also add, you're not alone. Everybody feels this way. So that's the first thing. The second thing to say on this as well is that what everybody writes on their Post-it notes, of course, is just their ideas. And what matters for business is not what you think as the person starting the business, it's how your stakeholders react to it. What do your stakeholders think about it? So as product designers, as user interface designers, it's not what you think is useful, it's what the customer actually finds useful in practice. And often there's a huge difference between, you know, the first sketch you come up with of your product and what you end up with. Can be massive differences. And so in that case, how do you figure out how to create a more useful sketch of your product before you actually invest in building it? Well, you show it to people. You talk to people about it. Maybe you even a little prototype of it. Right? You do exactly the same thing with the business model canvas, with the Flourishing Business Canvas. You write some Post-it notes and you find a potential customer and you say, hey, would you mind giving me 5 minutes and let me explain this to you and get your reactions? And they'll go, oh, well, I would never buy this, but my friend would. Or, oh, this is fantastic, but only if you were to do this too. And guess what? Those answers that you get are what you then use to improve your Post-it notes. And you iterate. And for some of you, you may have heard of something called Lean Startup. So Lean Startup is exactly the process I've just described. It's this process of learning, using the model as the description of what you're going to try and do, so that you've got a basis on which to learn.
Can I add just to that point? I think very often that at least with the business model canvas, I'm guessing it's the same with the Flourishing Canvas, is that you change the information in one box, and that's considered a pivot of your business. So you might keep everything the same and change your audience, your customer, and it becomes a different business. So that's the whole idea about, you know, changing out the different details and experimenting is, you know, 9 boxes, 8 are the same, 1 is different, it's a new business. And so you play with it. And I just, to kind of sympathize, even doing this with an existing business can take days, weeks, months to do. It's not like you do it in an afternoon, because it's super challenging to work out all the differences. So don't feel like you need to be able to check all those boxes right away, right?
Thank you. And back to that point, Hannah, we would recommend you never try and do this by yourself. Somebody else. It's actually when you write that Post-it note and you put it onto the canvas, what's important is that you share the understanding of what that Post-it note means, because you've only got a little, you know, 3 by 3 Post-it note. It's pretty small, right? Right, very much on. So you're summarizing some very complex ideas. So the purpose of the Post-it note is to allow you to get a shared understanding with another person. So typically in an existing business, for example, try and get the VPs together around the canvas. And guess what? It's usual for the finance VP and the marketing VP and the sales VP and the production VP to have a completely different understanding of who their customers are. They use different language, they use different words. And so just the process of getting them to agree, you know, the 6 or 7 words that they're going to write on that Post-it note is usually a massive insight for people.
I'll just share before we wrap up. If I don't think there's any other questions, but feel free to put them in the chat. But there was a comment in the chat that I'll just share. Anthony, you'd asked, how could this be useful to you in your work? So one comment is, this could be really helpful in evaluating new features for development. So I think if you think about if you have an existing product that you're working on, thinking about their impact outside of traditional stakeholders and metrics of business value. So I think that's another, you know, way to think about it. If not just a founder with a new business idea, but if you work on an existing product, how can this canvas be a conversation starter for your team and for, you know, leadership at your company to have we thought about these stakeholders? Have we thought about this measure of value that's beyond just financial value? We're at time, so thank you so much, Antony and Eric, for joining and sharing this presentation. And I think you mentioned the slides might be shared out afterwards. We've also been recording the session, so we will send that out afterwards as well, probably in a couple weeks' time. And we hope that you guys join us for our next meetup, which is on May 10th. It's a presentation called People, Planet, Pixels, and it's about the impact of technology on society and the environment and some of the hidden impacts of that and how to mitigate them. So thank you very much, Antony and Eric. Have a great day.
Thank you all very much. I'll just put a final plug in for the larger community of practice that Eric and I are both part of, which is the Strongly Sustainable Business Model Group, and I'm just going to put the link into that LinkedIn group into the chat right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.